Death. It's something we'll all come to know someday. It is the final test, the final rite of passage that we all must face alone. But what if someone could offer you a cheat sheet to that final test? What if you didn't have to take the test at all? John has found himself 50 feet underground in a state-of-the-art facility led by a fringe group who have an obsession with the afterlife and a certain kind of immortality. Though John may not be aware just yet, he is about to embark on the most unusual adventure that extends beyond his body and mind. The whirring of the tape began to accelerate until it became a hum. A stillness filled the air, more suffocating than silence. I never really thought about death, at least not in a real way. It just never seemed real to me. It was something characters did, or the old, and I had a lifetime before it became real. And then, just like everything in life, it came at the worst possible time. Again, what does death mean to you? I'm not sure. The absence of me? The end of everything. An all-encompassing black void, senseless nothingness. I need you to convince me, John. Convince you how? Of that what? You understand what will be asked of you. What does death mean to you? It means no more trees, no more memories to look back on, no more sky to look up at, no more cars, no more people, no more streets or cities. I'll miss all the sound and the smell of the weather about to change. I'll miss everyone I grew up with and never knew. I'll miss knowing what it means to be hungry and to hurt. I'll miss remembering what this meant to me once, when I'm someone, somewhere else. Describe it to me, John. It's black and dark and nothing, I suppose. Convince me. It's like staring into a Rothko painting, but one I don't think you'd want to have made. It's something ugly, primal, layers coating layers, deeper, tangled black vine-like veins, pulsing and swarming over each other. The longer my stare lingers, the less I can tell the difference between me and it. It feels like being asleep underwater, in a warm and endless lazy river. I have this feeling like I'm floating home. Are you afraid of dying, John? I've lost everything I've ever loved. Everyone. I've no family left, and no one I could call who would care what I have to say or how I'm feeling. Not where I've been, nor how bad things have gone. Am I afraid of death? My friend, there were days where I'd gladly welcome it. And now those two have left me. I am afraid of death. I am. I'm terrified of not being who I am anymore. Of losing grasp of everything I've ever known, of waking or being somewhere entirely alien in a body religious man, but I am a spiritual one. Well, that doesn't do much to silence those questions. I came here because I have to know. Because it's worth the gamble. To see. To find.
Do you believe in God, John?
No.
Do you know what our mission is here?
Your website says you offer a blissful transition to the afterlife. Free of fear, free of
What is it
hospitals.
that you think you are here for, John?
I'm here because I want to.
Why are you really here, John?
Because the only person that ever meant anything to me left behind her entire world for this place. Because if there is a universe in some sci-fi timeline where your claims are true, because I will die lonely. Either way.
And why did she come here?
It started with a sound, a single, solitary tone. At first, it resembled a smoke detector, an innocuous low frequency that seemed to swallow all sound around it, piercing through, collecting, and silencing anything in its path. His eyes were the first to greet the cold, sterile morning. There was a thickness to the air, something malleable that let him know he wasn't alone. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, and he found himself mid-thought as he threw himself out of the bed, gaining his footing only by stumbling over himself first, resorting to outstretching his hands to force some sort of balance in the universe. The door immediately opened, and at this moment, he was only half certain that this wasn't a dream. With all the movements of a sleepwalker, he swayed and bumped his way through the doorway, the impenetrable curtain of an underground labyrinth, parting with each slow-to-glow fluorescent bulb. When they finally all shone in unison, he noticed he wasn't the only silhouette standing in a doorway. There were 4. The lights were too bright to take in more than simple shapes, and he thought as much before the tone stretched into a new sound. This one made the hinges rattle. It was deep and heavy. It vibrated off the porcelain hallways and shook the fabric on his skin. It felt like being sucker punched by a cluster headache. He'd expected his eyes to go dizzy, but not for his knees to buckle. He caught himself, the prospect of falling waking him up entirely now. Please follow the blue line to today's lesson. A phosphorescent blue began to emit from the ground. It moved in a slowly unfurling string of hazy light. It inched past each of the 4. He followed it as it slid along like a serpent on its belly. He was in trance, and would have remained that way if it wasn't for the corner it eventually nipped behind and slipped down. Thankful to have his mind back, his feet went to shuffle off into the hallway. But before he could, the other four had already moved past him in uniform motion. They reminded him of a school of fish, and he followed the last of them. He didn't expect for him to be alone, but he also didn't expect company. After all, what did she have in common with these people? They'd taken at least 2 turns before it dawned on him that he had no breadcrumb trail to lead him back to that room. The light seemed to extinguish itself as soon as his heels had lifted, and there was a new feeling of being lost. Not like a kid would in a shopping center, but how an astronaut might when his tether broke and he was slowly drifting away. He turned his head to see the same unmarked walls that resembled every other wall he'd seen since he'd been down here. His clothes were the same color, and he wondered if soon, so too, would his skin. He turned to see an enormous eyesore of a doorway, cartoonishly ornate and completely out of place. The brass and gold colors staining the pale setting in a remarkably offensive way. Like life, mocking the newly deceased. The room, the ballroom, was something only Jules Verne could imagine. It was domed, a glass structure that revealed a view of some place or thing that could not exist on Earth. No, not the Earth he knew. What lay outside the sphere's windows were impossible to tell. A smoky, shadow-like fluid, swirled in deep purples and green, accented with momentary flashes of blinding light. It illuminated the larger forms for just the briefest of seconds, as the shapes swam and hid around the enclosure. A strange magnetism drew them each to their marks, almost on cue. This natural formation was both distant, yet near one another. The other four, who he had yet to still fully acknowledge as anything more than placeholders, stared ahead in anxious uncertainty. He wondered what this place had meant to them in that moment, and foolishly, like the child he secretly was, attempted to make eye contact, to understand something words couldn't say. When his attention folded back on itself, it was because of the chairs. 5 of them that created a circle around where they stood now. Without further instruction, the 4 walked in a straight path that led them each to one of the 5 chairs. He stared at the one meant for him and felt like a pet might after seeing their owner again for the first time in years. The unusual pull of it was enough to break the trance he was in. A new rising panic that he could become so removed from himself on command. And how? Even Pavlov's dog needed to be trained. He couldn't squeeze the last of the thought out before its silent retreat. Instead, he found himself watching as the whites of shoes lifted off the ground, an idiosyncratic pattern that all the same kept to a particular rhythm. He met their directional turn with a secret horror, like two cars changing course on a one-way highway. He anticipated the inevitable and felt his body lean back into the chair. It spoke like his imagination, the precursor that selectively generated the better of his thoughts. The voice, or idea, was grey in tone. It slithered around his skull and pulled at his eyes, emerging in bursts only to crawl back behind the walls of his mind. And it wasn't familiar, and it didn't feel friendly. And if there was a feeling to it at all, it was indifferent. And then it happened. Imagery, sensations, and memories all at once, folding over one another like the drowning limbs of 1,000 entangled lives. In an instant, he was beneath and a part of an infinite sky. He was 1,000 eyes in the soil, 1,000 minds asleep. The instinct has somehow gained footing, quickly being replaced by the sensation of floating. He knew this feeling, a feeling like nothing before, and yet somehow this felt familiar. And there was a push, somewhere deep within him, that unlocked secrets sunken within a collective memory he could not escape. He felt himself falling backwards, through himself, and then, like a rare color or a flavor lost to time, he suddenly recalled everything there was to know about the sensation. And the knowing enveloped his every cell, from the physical to the intangible and the forever. It was death. He had known it before, and he knew, somewhere in him, that he would know it again. Here, in this chair, he was a part of all he was and was not. He was life unfurling and a crawling death. It felt like standing up inside the shadow of himself, a swirling weakness that gave his effervescent body an order to sleep. And he wanted to close his eyes and disappear. But the voice spoke again, like fireworks of indescribable dimensions, exploding in the sky of his mind. The flashing lights and impossible geometry now cascading into symbols that he knew he would someday be at some point in time. And he felt himself sailing through the sky as he watched from below. But he wasn't alone. He wasn't alone in any form or state. And what felt like an old companion who had never left his side whispered a gentle reminder into his ears. He was everywhere now, innumerable fragments of an indescribable whole, and yet he was never more himself. Though his body, its appearance, and knowable history, the connections it's made, seemed as forgettable and unknowable as a breakfast he had when he was 3. Still, nothing was lost. Yet, the memory of it seemed to be less important to hold on to. He was home, floating along in an endless lazy river of television static. He no longer thought to think. The mind he formerly knew, echoing sentiments of rejoicing, communing, belonging, as it happily dissolved into the ether of time. The chair shook, and suddenly he was repelled, as if crashing through invisible walls that hurled his senses in every direction. He tried in vain to steady, to focus, to latch onto some identical notion of reality, as his being screamed 1,000 cries of deathless terror. He felt himself begin to divide, spilling through further windows of reality, falling, chaotically spinning, helpless. He began to feel his every atom being held onto, as if being pulled, kept, stolen in time. He felt his presence rise through the crevice of all of existence, clawing and gnashing their teeth down on any piece of matter they could keep. He felt portions of a part of himself he'd never known begin to be torn apart. Spurning, deep, carving sensations burrowed somehow deeper into him. His perspective still shifting, now into identifiable colors, shapes, then sound too. He felt the kaleidoscope vision tighten and shift, until the periscopic view he held onto like a cliff's edge went black. It took a minute to realize his eyes were still closed, and when he did, he was hesitant to open them. The sensation itself feeling as inordinary as a plant being forced to pilot a fleshy machine for the first time. And what he saw caused him to shut them just as fast. And he was back. But that hadn't changed what he had seen and felt, and what he now knew. All of that, though like looking at a memory through a tube television, was still very much with him, in his head. It crowded and slithered, wrapped itself around every loose thought in his mind, until he was sure he'd implode from the pressure within. The images still hurtling through his mind's eye. There was no room left to think, and he felt the thing that was his mind begin to grasp for air. Quickly, he began to navigate his thoughts through the firewall. His eyes, he used those to see the chair, so his body could sit, so he didn't have to stand on his legs. Something that belonged to a person, to a human. His mind spiraling, but now along the runway to a safe landing. He began to feel his hands and his limbs again. He moved his tongue, opened his mouth. He'd almost piloted himself neatly back into his shell when it was a burst of light. It exploded in amber from behind the cover of his eyelids. They opened automatically, and his jaw dropped. There, not 10 feet from him, a fiery hellscape of flailing limbs slid off cindered bone and rang out onto the marble floor. The shrillest, unnatural guttural throating of a half-torched tongue emoted a spirit chair went from primal, animalistic tremors to a static, lone fire. And all he could do was stare. Words had yet to return to his tongue, and in their absence, he wailed. He remembered thinking, before he couldn't anymore, against the infinite abyss. He'd never seen the color orange so bright before. There are so many things I could say, even now, but I think it would be lost on you. And everyone who could understand, well, they're a million miles away from their bodies now. I know what people say about this place. My whole life, I've been warned against those types of people. And somehow, they've always found me. Can I ask you, outright, right now? Because this could be the dumbest or the smartest thing I've ever done. And I would just like to be sure. Maybe for once. About something. Like it's okay to fully believe in something again.
What is it that you think you are here for, Rose?
Because I think I'm finally ready.
Please, explain.
I don't know if I can. It's like when you know a conversation is about to end. Suddenly all the air has left your sails. Like some connection's been broken. That's kind of how it feels. Most days. Like some kind of tether's been broken. At night, I feel like a balloon that's left a child's hand. Drifting up and out. Blankets of night and nothingness. And in the morning, as I'm coming to, my first thoughts are of a shipwrecked explorer with no refuge to escape reality, lost somewhere forever.
Do you know what our mission is here, Rose?
I do.
What is it that you are here for, Rose?
Because I'm ready to pop that balloon. Because I'm hoping the next island I'm marooned on has a better view. Because it has to. My whole life, I always did what they said. I listened, I followed all the rules, and they took, and everyone told me I was crazy to come here. That it was suicide. But I don't see it that way. I see it as a way out of a maze. Something to believe in again. Something to look forward to. I just want something new to look forward to.
Regrettably,
Please, 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 please.
you have failed many of our tests. You do not belong here, Rose. Not yet.
There has to be something. There has to be something I can do. I don't belong here anymore.
Down here, Rose, the cost of mistakes Down here, there are consequences that can last an eternity.
His arms pressed up against it first, but his thoughts were still with sleep, gently luring his awareness to a trapdoor below. What remained was the imprint of a feeling he'd known once, cocooned in his bed on a winter morning. His mother would be coming down the hallway soon now. There would be another day, full of classes, books, and he watched as the school bus in his mind drove away. He saw the floorboards begin to crumble beneath his mother's feet, and before he had the sense to know where he was, he watched her smile dissolve back into that impenetrable dark. He dared his eyes to open, and when they did, he wasn't sure if there was any difference to it at all. It was like staring down that same hallway. It was an unusual kind of dark, more like the absence of anything than a color, but with a certain weight to it. A hum emanated from the floor beneath him, and with it, an expanding glow that came from no singular source. It spilled in like a fog, pooling in misshapen waves around the bed. Fascinated, he watched as it swirled and rose up from the floor, stalking, creeping, surrounding his body in light. His mind filled in the gaps. To him, it looked like he was in the web of some ethereal horror. His mind's eye continued drafting scenes against his will. He wasn't in a room. No. He was about to be consumed, devoured whole. It would only be a matter of time now. An array of metallic clicks and pops caused his eyes to drift to circular mechanisms that lined his door. They moved in spiral patterns, and he thought he'd remembered the dark of that hallway. And yet, as the door slowly opened, somehow it seemed deeper than before. As a kid, he used to spend his summers in the woods with his brothers. He'd seen the glazed-over stare of those curious animals, seconds before they pounced on the bait. He wondered if he looked the same to whatever was looking in from that hallway now. He didn't dare to move, even as the glowing, cloudy miasma began to drift off into its direction. He refused to take his eyes off that emptiness. If it wanted to take him then and there, he would go with his eyes open, fighting. Then, like a vintage transistor radio coming to life, he heard the now familiar voice once more. Please follow the green line to today's lesson. The light illuminated, and he saw those who remained standing similarly in the doorways. Their bodies seemed less rigid, more present, more fragile today. None made eye contact. A secondary tone emitted, this time sharper, with a higher pitch that seemed to sever the link to his rational mind and made the most automatic of tasks impossible. A beam emitted from the ground in deep forest green. Its steady processions marched down the hallway. He didn't want, but then he saw the rest of them move. The uniform motion from yesterday was lost. A clumsy panic preceded their steps. The interior light of his room had all but spilled out into the hallway, leaving only an echo of itself in the door. And if he didn't act now, in a moment, he would be wrapped up in that same void. And for some reason, presently unknown to him, nothing scared him more than the infinite possibilities the darkness down here held. He propelled himself through the corridor and found himself chasing the faint glimpses of the eerie glowing tail of lights. They continued to whip and swirl. It slipped and darted from corner to corner, and by now the faint traces had turned to almost indistinguishable fragments of a memory. Was he actually following their trail? Or was it a further trick of the dark? He was all but certain he'd been chasing phantoms for the last 2 turns, convinced that all that was left was to wait for that darkness to eventually catch up to him. His feet slipped on the tile as he raced around another sharp corner, and he landed on his knees in the prayer position. Raising his gaze from the floor, he saw the backs of the group. They were in some sort of huddle, choosing to lean on each other rather than any of the walls. He'd been in such a fever pace trying not to get left behind that his emotions caught him by surprise. The relief to be with the group again, the absurdity of feeling safe now just because of it. An instinctual fear awoke when he realized they were in front of yet another lavishly decorated door. The questions came pouring out like a flood. What had happened in that room? Where was that woman now? Was any of that real? Had he been drugged? The door opened. He didn't remember walking through. Like yesterday, it all happened in disconnected fragments, like memories being played back in his mind just after the act had occurred. What he did remember was the dancing flames of the candelabras that decorated the entrance. And it wasn't the flame or the fire so much as the feeling that not even the elements of nature belonged in this place. Why did every thought seem like a puzzle that was slowly being reassembled in bad faith? Like certain pieces were intentionally missing. There were no chairs in this room, and what could be interned from the candlelight was a circle lined with herbs and crystalline fragments. They lined the perimeter of the impossible. It was a hole. No, a canyon. It was bigger and looked deeper than anything he had ever seen or could even imagine to be real. The others kept a distance from it, and then, like a switch being turned on, they began to walk in opposite directions, encircling the hole, sitting at odd intersections, their hands folded on their knees. Like the chairs, He felt the most unusual pull. It seemed to sing to him from the depths. It was at that moment he realized he was no longer standing. He was now on all fours, inching closer, creeping one carefully unstable limb at a time, closer to the edge. His hands pressed down onto one of the crystal shards, and he momentarily came back to himself. He looked around to notice they were all in the same abstract formation. He wrestled to keep control of himself. It felt like waking up from and fainting again and again in clumsy, repetitive cycles. It was then that he felt the same heavy presence in the room with him now. It seemed to want to offset some kind of balance in the space. Whatever it was the same kind of heavy he'd felt in the hallway and in the center of the ballroom. The others stared, mouths agape, eyes blank, and he felt the hairs on his head slowly reach out to whatever lingered in the center. That's when the voice began to speak. Like before, it appeared in the field of his imagination. What it said felt nostalgic and new, like recalling a distant nursery rhyme, only now understanding the meaning behind it all. I will show you how to remember what you are and were before. Open the door. Let me inside. He felt his eyes close, and suddenly he was in the kitchen of the house he'd grown up in. Across the table from him was a presence, indiscernible to his eyes, glowing like heat waves of hot asphalt. He couldn't get his mouth to form words, so he shouted his thoughts. But they weren't alone. He heard others. They occupied the same space where his thoughts lived. A cacophony of panicked, fearful sounds. Where am I? What is happening? What is this? I can't. And then his head was once again silent, left to echo only his own questions. Am I dead? Is this heaven? There are places older than heaven, John, and there are forgotten paths to lead us back. This can't be real. You know why you are here, John. You've been here so many times before, just like we have. And we have learned so much about what comes next, what to expect. Together, I don't know who or what you are, but I don't want any of this. I came here to find. You can leave, John. But you'll always come back to this moment, this choice. You know this. I've been. She is still here, John. Farah, some of us never leave. Some of us need an extra hand to guide us home. What have you done to her? She made the same choice you will. Some are not yet meant for these trials. Chairs. There was a place I saw in that ballroom. The woman. What did you do to that woman? Strange phenomena can happen to those who are not yet ready to cross. fire? That was real?
It's easier if I show you, John.
A kaleidoscope began to stretch over the sky in his mind's eye. Visions of wheels within wheels, of faces aging, of mountains dissolving, of light moving, an orchestration that the more he tried to focus on, the more strange and unworldly the sights he began to see. Winding paths, intersecting, dissolving and reforming, limbs, blood, hair and teeth, falling apart, coming together in shapes familiar and unknown, always in cycles, circles, collapsing into each other.
This is your future, John, your past and present. But there is a way out.
He stared deeper, longer, noticing human limbs becoming animalistic, taking on their features only to dissolve again, this time in spectacular bursts of light that seemed to envelope the wheels and force them to spin faster until eventually they were gone entirely. I don't understand.
But you did once, John, when you had a different name and body.
It's been hundreds of years since then. That's not possible.
You came back for us, John.
No.
To guide us, as you once showed us. To break the cycle. To leave the wheel.
He found himself back in that silent kitchen from his youth. Everything was just as he remembered it. The walls, the hanging ornaments, the plants, everything except for the photographs. Every one of them that hung or lined the tables, all held black portraits of that dark nothing where faces ought to be.
You made the chairs as a tool, John. But what we learned since you left us is that not all souls are ready to leave their body. I will teach you how to travel again without such tools. I will help you remember how to turn off the house.
He felt himself being lifted by some unknown force, and suddenly he was in the living room. Not how it last looked, but how it did when he was a child. Across the table from him was that same presence, now shifting from the familiar, deceased relative faces to former friends and altogether strangers to him.
Imagine all that you know, all you ever learned and have seen, form the walls of a house. This is your house. Within these rooms are all of your collective memories from this life and the many before it. What you know as a refuge can become a prison if you forget how to leave. Imagine yourself at the center of the house. This is its heart. Visualize it as a shimmering white crystal, radiating pure light that crawls up past the stairs and sails into each of the rooms, covers the carpets and coats the ceilings. Imagine how the house looks, glowing from within, as it might from the outside. Imagine seeing it from the sky, Now imagine forming a prism of light around it. This is to protect your present body from those who might wander in. The house is filled with everything that ties you to this plane. To leave, we will need to momentarily forget about what was. Begin by walking through the rooms of your house. Turn off the lights in the family room. Let the dark cover their furniture. Close the bedroom doors. Forget your possessions, memories, and friends. Take the photos and place them in boxes. Place them in the furnace. As you do, imagine the same brilliant lights emanating from deep within your chest. Spread to and engulf the box in a brilliant fire. Lock the basement. Now walk to the center of the house. Feel the light begin to move through your extremities, causing your body to glow. Reach up to the chandelier and let the glow extend to it. Let it spread through the house, coating everything in a luminescence. As you stand in the center, turn off that light switch in your mind.
As he did, the glowing lines that made up the framework of his childhood home began to vibrate in unrecognizable waves of twisting frequencies, free of all conception, free of all knowledge and history. Walk outside, without yourself, outside of yourself. Tell me, John, what is it that you see? The voice spoke through him then, the hand inside him. It pulled him out of himself once more. Like yesterday, he felt his body floating further and further from his mind. But unlike yesterday, he felt the others, and he followed them. Through hot bursts of energy like 1,000 suns, through voids where thought was not possible, blinking and reappearing as nothing, as everything. It felt like being held up by 1,000,000 small kites, each delicate and purposefully placed, meant to cushion, sail, and steer him. It was just then that the infinitely expansive, open view of space began to lilt and fall over itself, crumbling as it collapsed into larger and larger impossible shapes, whose monstrous corners and jagged teeth began to tear through some unseen defense. With each careless movement, new sensations could be felt. It was like seeing through an overlapping, cascading series of mirrors. His eyes danced as he attempted to focus them. For as he did, each vision, as if detected, would coil and collapse into itself. His gaze was everywhere now. He no longer saw mirrors, but different strands that led to different lives in time, different forms in different places, that experienced life through sensations our bodies could never know. The few remaining memories of what it meant to be a person were eroding without any resistance. It happened as naturally as a child outgrowing their old clothes. And with that,
he discarded fear, want, and desire. His mind's eye played a cinematic clip of an astronaut leaving a space shuttle, and instinctively, he knew that he was that astronaut. And with a gentle push from that eternal family, he waved goodbye to the trees, the sky, sand, and the ocean. He watched the astronaut take off his spacesuit, holding all relatable memory to what he once was, and carefully place it down. Naked, but before a grand river of glowing television static, he waited for a sign. Something in him knew that the river before him would bring him home, but it didn't feel right. Deep inside a memory of a time he shouldn't have been able to recall, he knew that the river would sever the only voice he'd ever known, that it would absorb and dissolve his essence, that the light behind his thoughts would flicker out and be extinguished forever in that stream, that he would lose. Farah spoke to him then, but what she said caused all of the pieces of himself spread across time and space to fall asleep. They lie. It was like walking through a fog, only he wasn't sure if his eyes were quite open. Everything was at a distance, like watching a film in an empty movie theater. But there, on the screen, were what his eyes saw. And there, he was, in the back row, left only to take in what the reel was showing. "Peter," a voice spoke, and the scene shifted, now taking in shape of an outline of a person. They looked about 30, with clothes that seemed to suggest a costume party, or a role in some elaborate play. An echo unlike any before emerged from inside his head, and reverberated off the theatre walls. The camera darted to a lavishly decorated dome structure. It was surrounded by smiling eyes and waving hands, adoration pooling in waves around him. He felt a sense of pride, of wonder, of certainty. The scene now shifting, perspective closing in and out as he gave hugs and shook hands. His feet took the lead and walked a narrow staircase that led to an ornate podium. He spoke with a voice that repeated words he'd known before. Kept like fleas in a jar, we have forgotten how to jump after being bound for so long. We have forgotten what we learned and once held so sacred. But we are here now, awake, and while we are, we will make sure we do not fall back asleep so easily. The camera turned to show an arrangement of instruments. These inventions were not born of my mind. They were given to me in my sleep, and after some time, I learned how to rebuild them here in the waking world. I traveled alone, without any guides or instructions. I lost myself, my body. I forgot what it meant to be human, to eat, to sleep. I was lost in a single second, frozen eternally as time marched on. And somehow, I always managed to find a way back to myself. Those were the early years, before we found each other, before the true work began. And together, we read dead tongues, manipulated reality, and learned to cheat fate itself. John attempted to get up from his seat in the theater, only to realize he had no command over his body at all. An instinctual fear grew inside him. His eyes scanned the theater, and he noticed he wasn't alone. Spread out, and just as still, were others. They all wore the same colorless outfit and stared motionless at the screen. Where others busied their lives chasing revolution, we are here today to perform an evolution. The screen was now filled with chalkboard diagrams, mathematics, and strange illustrations. Though the wheels of samsara may ring eternal, that may only be true for those of us unfortunate enough to live and die as humans. A test that only those who believed beyond what they could see were even capable of taking. Yes, though our perception and true abilities are bound by the forms we hold now, those of the animal kind are not. They walk between the world of illusion and that of the divine. They can see the maze, the game for what it is, and they can speak to those older than time itself. My friends, today we steal fire from the gods. The scene shifted to larger diagrams, showing a male and female body, with a tetrahedron surrounding them. It showed an animal speaking to an angel, It showed the animal dying, with the same tetrahedron around it, and being reborn in the next frame. With these tools, we will be each other's guide outside of our bodies, to explore, to seek, to find and know. And we will walk each other home with these tools, one by one. We will continue the process, learning all we can, until we know how to leave this cycle entirely. We will lift the lid of our own jaw and jump into the unknown, to relearn all that we have forgotten, and in time become gods once more. The crowd leapt to their feet. The screen went black, and John no longer found himself in a theater. Where he was now was hard to describe. He felt like a pilot, navigating a plane through an electrical storm. Or at least, that's the scene his mind's eye played. Each burst of light across the horizon, flashing with scenes and memories. They flooded his blood with a knowing he couldn't explain. He saw strange instruments, emitting colors once attached to the tongue. It displayed silhouettes of animals, like projections on a wall. He saw the group sitting in a hexagon formation. He noticed a newborn sheep in the middle. He noticed their eyes, now solid white, and realized they were in those same chairs from the ballroom. The clouds burst, and the plane accelerated, until the sky in his mind was one bright light. He saw different faces in the same formation. He saw a domed ballroom decorated with portraits and numbers. And then he woke up. He didn't find himself in that room like he had before. He was on the floor, face down, with a view of two boots before his slow-to-open eyes. The one who interviewed him spoke first. "You had no idea what you were doing, John, and we gave our souls to you." John felt the heel of one of the boots being placed firmly on the back of his neck. "You were right about the animals. They saw what we couldn't. And those tools of yours, the instruments you made, they did teach us how to walk between worlds, and how to recognize each other outside our bodies." The boot pressed down harder. "And somehow you knew that with every death and rebirth, our psychic strength would increase. So when we were reborn, we would keep those memories of all the sights we'd seen." John tried, but couldn't lift his head. Of course, the remembering, the awakening, that took longer to understand. But you knew how to solve that too. You used symbols, old dead languages. You knew somewhere inside the deepest part of ourselves, something would recognize them. Something we'd never known would reach up and grab for it. John pushed himself up from the floor, throwing the interviewer off balance. The interviewer landed on his back and laughed. "You're special, John. Not like the others. There's something inside you. Something we need. Suddenly, John remembered the last thing Farah had said to him when he was about to step into that static sea. You brought me here as a sacrifice. The interviewer slowly lifting himself off the floor now. Here, John? And exactly where is here, John? Do you remember driving here? When was the last time you remember eating or drinking? Tell me, John, what is my name? John looked at the interviewer, as if noticing the lines and curves that made up his face for the first time. It all started with you, Peter. That spark, that antenna inside of you. You don't even know what it's capable of, what it could do. The interviewer lunged at him, revealing an iron bat that connected with John's ribs. There are rules, John. Rules not even I can break. He swung again, this time connecting with one of John's outstretched hands. The sound of bone breaking and a deep cry rushing out of John's mouth. He sprawled onto the floor, desperate to hide in the shadows of that room, sliding along on his belly, looking for some patch of emptiness that might lead to an exit. Something followed us back. Something woke up somewhere. And when we returned, in other forms, in other lives, it knew. It's beyond our concept of life and death. It's erasing them, one by one, with each cycle. Let's make the return journey home. Something is stalking them in the astral realm. Something is erasing them in all their previous incarnations from existing at all. I don't want to remember anymore, John. I don't want to disappear like them. John outstretched his arms, finding an emptiness in the wall, and pressed his body into it. Falling out into the hallway, he quickly picked himself up and began taking turn after turn, stumbling, colliding, and bouncing off of walls that seemed to manifest out of thin air. It was in that labyrinth that his eyes began to imagine her face, as if she was steering his ship across impossible waters. He looked up, in astonishment to find himself before the ballroom entrance. He wasn't sure why, or if it were his choice at all, but he walked directly towards it. The smell of burnt wood still heavy in the room. He knew where to find her. If she still existed at all, he knew where they'd all be, if any of them still were. He took off his shoes carefully and sat into the chair. He leaned his body back and let his eyes roll upwards. He saw the glowing shapes as they swam around the dome. There were so many of them now. Too many. And just as suddenly as he heard a voice in his head again, his eyes opened in his mind, and they were in her garden. He smelled fresh grass, and a warm sun on his back.
Don't be afraid. He knows you're here.
Farah, I'm so sorry, I don't understand.
He wants to stay in the dream. He made a deal with that thing. It was a mistake. We didn't know what we were capable of, and then it was all too late.
Please, I don't remember. The garden began to become overgrown with weeds. Insects rose from the soil, and the clouds began to fill the sky.
You're not where you think you are. You haven't been for quite some time. Where am I? It wants to look inside, to know all your past lives. It wants to walk between your dreams and into others.
Farah,
You used to call me Sophia.
The sky went black, and the surrounding woods became filled with hungry eyes.
He's almost here now. You have to leave, Peter. It's tired of living in the world it's created. It wants the real thing.
Farah, please. Storm increased, and the trees began to topple over.
It wants to eat what's in your soul.
An enormous rolling storm descended upon the ground and swept across the land, 1,000 miles per hour, and within an instant, both he and Farah were consumed. He opened his eyes and found himself in a dark room with a lone light bulb hanging from a wire, about 10 feet from where he stood. If only you just listened and let go, you wouldn't have had to see the horrors of reality, our reality. The darkness of the room instantly removed, replaced by the interior of the ballroom. John, still sitting, the interviewer, across, his body bound to a chair.
Let me show you, John.
Like interlocking set pieces of a play, the once decorated walls of the old ballroom peeled away, revealing a pulsating mass of gurgling flesh that spewed vicious liquid and seemed to inhale with odd tremors. The skylight at the dome was gone, replaced by slithering tree-like vines that wrapped and bulged in hypnotic fashion. The more he looked, the more entangled the swarms of limbs began to grow. Encircling the entire chamber now, he looked to his feet to see strange flesh-like ooze crawling up his legs. He felt it tighten and constrict around his body, slowly pulling him down into the floor. It coiled around John's neck, pushing in, searching for a cavity to enter through.
All you have to do is let me in.
Suddenly, John felt a gnawing at his eyes, and before he could think of what to do next, he felt it push past his eyelids and begin to fill the inside of his head. He felt himself drown, dissolving, as the entity reached deeper and deeper into his mind. He was back in that theater now, in the last row. He saw skies filled with tendrils, swarming masses pulsating over continent-sized areas of land. He saw planets, universes, galaxies. He felt a hopelessness inside him, a growing darkness, and with it, a growing need for sleep.
It wants you to believe this is real,
she said over the theater speakers. take my hand?" John raised the hand inside him and felt himself hurling back outside of himself. He saw numbers, flashes of primary colors. He saw a camera and a photograph, and he knew he was the man behind the camera as well. Once all symbols had left him, he woke up and found himself on warm sand. He got to his feet, feeling rested, rejuvenated. He hadn't felt his body respond, so quick to the commands of his mind in years. And then he saw her, like for the first time, not as a shadow or a memory, but as a living thing, and full of beauty. I tried to recreate it as best I could. It's my favorite place, my favorite memory, a family trip when I was 12. There's no way to go back now, John. Not like before. But we can do something, you and I, to make sure it doesn't leave or get through. Are we safe here? For now, but not forever. It knows this place too. How's that possible? It comes from here. It's where it was born. But it wasn't always this. I don't know what it is now, but it's hungry, and the world it's made for itself just isn't enough anymore. Not after I learned about you and the others, through our memories, the ones we all share. It waited for us in the astral realm. It waited, and it knew that we were vulnerable and exposed. It took them, one by one, on their way back home, trapping them in illusions, parallel heavens or hells of their own beliefs. It feeds on them, John. And it's been trying to learn more about you, using illusions and tricks to dig deeper into your psyche and memories, to mine your soul and who you've been. It knows who we are more than we do now. Why me? Why me, Farah? Why me? There's something inside you, John. Something that can connect to the original spark. Like an antenna, it connects you to something older than all of us. Me? You made the tools, John. Something beyond had spoken through you, whether you knew it or not. The sky grew dark, and the clouds began to fill with a smoky miasma. I don't know what will happen if it finds that connection in you, but it's created entire worlds to try and find it. John looked up at the sky as a thick, oily rain began to pour. It's here, John. The sun in the sky began to grow darker, deep shades of purple. Spiraling circles of smoke encircled it now, and it glowed. They both stared as it began to grow larger, to move closer. John stared in astonishment as the trees in the horizon began to float into the air like a blown dandelion, swirling carelessly up into the sun. I'm sorry, John, but I don't know any other way. Farah kneeled onto the ground. She parted the sand with her hands. As her tears formed a pool, the pool began to expand, water rising from the ground until it had made its way halfway up her body. She looked back at John, her face shifting to previous incarnations of itself. Maybe it was always meant to end this way. The water level now up to her chin, John watched as it moved up and over her still staring eyes. John stepped backwards, the water continuing to spread. He looked for some higher vantage point, when he felt the ground beneath his feet began to shift. In an instant, he found himself atop some rocky cliff, overlooking the water that had now become a sea. Its waves grew taller and more violent, splashing and rising, each wave growing larger. He raised his eyes to see the hideous, misshapen sun pulsing and trembling as it took over the entire sky. He saw the water rising as if being elevated, an enormous horizontal tidal wave that then shape-shifted into two open hands. He saw them rocket through the air towards the descending sun, as if to catch or swallow it whole. He remembered seeing the light of that star as he looked through the 1,000-mile-high wall of water. Its deep purple shone somehow brighter through the serene blues. He didn't remember waking up, but he found himself in the dark. He stared out into the emptiness. All thoughts had left his mind, but one. Farah. I'm here, John. Like a bulb slowly coming to life, he saw an indescribable array of shimmering light begin to emit from just beyond his vision sight. Farah slowly walked out of the blinding light and came to his side. Farah, where are we? It's okay, John. Everything is okay now. For some reason he couldn't place, it felt like it was his birthday, and he smiled from ear to ear. I don't understand, but I'm so happy. Everything is going to be perfect from now on. Everything. They walked closer until the light began to make silhouettes of them. It almost feels like we're walking on the moon. How funny. We are, John. Everything is perfect now. John didn't think anything of it. John didn't care to think at all. With every new step he took towards the light, more and more of his memories seemed to fall away from him. Like burdensome, waterlogged clothes, he felt happy to discard them, to be with Farah, to be on the moon, or wherever he was.